Hello and welcome back to 10 Things About Writing. Today I'm going to talk about dialogue, which, when I was starting off, was the area that I felt needed most work. And it took me a long time to understand how dialogue works and why I was finding it so difficult. And I wrote a couple of books where the dialogue was really quite bad. The good news is you can learn from my mistakes, because bad dialogue, though very common, is generally commonly easy to fix. Now, you have to think, first of all, why you inserted the dialogue in your narrative in the first place. There could be a number of reasons, all of them good. One, it advances the plot in some way. It's sometimes much easier to have a quick conversation between two characters about something that's going to happen than to wade into a long piece of narrative and description about what it's going to be. Sometimes it's a good shortcut. It's often a great way of showing how characters interact. It can be a powerful characterization tool. Think about how you talk to other people. Think how differently you can talk to a stranger, a friend, a lover, a child, somebody in authority, somebody you're slightly frightened of, somebody you dislike. All of these things are tools in your armoury of characterisation, and dialogue is a way of facilitating that. So that's great. If you can't think why you inserted a piece of dialogue, then it might be a good idea to look at whether or not you can do without it. But it is generally good to have dialogue in a story. In a novel, it's useful to break up the pace of your narrative and speed your pace up with dialogue. Dialogue tends to speed things up, whereas description tends to slow things down. And so I tend to have a rule of thumb whereby I have dialogue maybe every 4 or 5 pages. It doesn't have to be a lot, it can just be a little tiny bit. It breaks things up, it makes it feel more fluid, it accentuates your characterization rather than concentrating just on your plot. It's a good way of keeping the momentum going. Now, I'm going to talk about a piece of dialogue which isn't great. I'm not taking this from a colleague's book. Instead, I'm using one of my own books, an early edition of Sleep, Pale Sister, which was a Gothic novel that I wrote in the early 90s. Now, there is in existence an edited, redacted version where I think I knocked a lot of the edges off the original text. This is the unredacted original text, and I'm going to just go through it in a sort of slightly impromptu way and see what can be fixed here. Now, this piece of dialogue is between the protagonist, Effie, who is a typical Victorian ingenue, and her lover Mose, who is a lovable rogue who is just beginning to show that actually underneath he's a bit less lovable than we all thought. And it's a scene which is quite important in the book, because this is the moment where Effie starts to gain agency and understand that she is being manipulated by the men in her life. So I'll just read it through as it is, unredacted, and I want you to listen to some of the things I think are wrong with it. I think it's wordy, it's a bit clumsy, it's a bit turgid, and we're going to try and fix that. "Don't drink any more of that," said Mose irritably. "It's getting late. Let's get you back home." I shook my head. "I'd like to stay here for a moment longer," I said with assumed calm. "It will be hours before Henry gets back from his studio, and even if I am late, he'd never guess where I had been." I laughed then with a bitter recklessness. "Maybe I should tell him." "I hope that was an attempt at humour," said Mose with a dangerous calm. "I'm sure you do." I heard the brittle note in my voice and tried to adopt Fanny's light, confident tone. "But then you do have an interest in Henry's continued goodwill. After all, you're seducing his wife, aren't you?" I saw contempt and anger in his face, but was unable to stop. "You have an odd notion of propriety," I added. "I dare say you think a man can get away with any crime, any betrayal, as long as appearances are safeguarded. I don't suppose it matters at all to you whether I suffer or not." "You're overwrought," he snapped coldly. "Not at all." My laugh was shrill, helpless. "I expect you to know all about pretense. After all, you're an expert." Okay, it's not terrible, but it's not great either, and I think it can be fixed quite easily. Now, what I've done is I have marked up this page to show you here. And you will see that in green there are the actual words that the characters are speaking. In pink, there are the dialogue tags and the stage directions and the way these lines are supposed to be delivered. Now, if you have read self-help books before, you will have seen that one of the things that you're told frequently by authors about dialogue is to avoid dialogue tags as much as you can, to avoid adverbs particularly, because they don't always contribute a great deal. Now, I'm always a bit reluctant to establish rules about writing because I don't think that it's really possible to say there is a hard and fast rule about any aspect of writing at all. If it works, it works, regardless of whether you followed a rule or not. But I do think that there's a point to be made about dialogue tags and particularly adverbs, what they do, the role of them, if you like, in a piece of dialogue, and sometimes you might actually need them, is to put a stress on how something is said. They are effectively stage directions. So all this stuff in here about said Mose irritably, or I said with assumed calm, or he snapped coldly, all this kind of stuff. This is what I'm talking about. All of these things are probably things that shouldn't be there because they take away attention from what is being said by the characters, which is important, to the way that it's being said, which is less important, because actually, if you look at the lines, "Don't drink any more of that," said Mose irritably. "It's getting late. Let's get you back home." Well, you know what? I could take that irritably away because the short sentences that I've used kind of assume that he is a bit short-tempered already, and so I don't need to say irritably because the reader is smart enough to work that out already by what he has said. The same goes with "You're overwrought," he snapped coldly. For a start, if he snapped, it probably wasn't with warmth and friendliness, so I can get rid of the coldly anyway because it's one extra description. And I can also probably get rid of the snapped too, because it kind of figures that after that conversation, he is not going to be speaking in long, flowing, warm, comforting sentences. I've already said it by using the words that I've used in that conversation. So those things can go already. I know this instinctively now because I've had years and years to build up instincts of editing. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to reread it and rapidly redact most of those dialogue tags and most of those stage directions. I think I'll keep just the odd little bit here. There are some gestures which are useful, and sometimes instead of just putting "he said, she said," sometimes it's quite nice to break up a dialogue with a gesture. That way you don't get the repetitiveness, but also you don't start to question who is speaking at any given time. And this is especially true of a conversation with more than two people in. This one's not too bad for that because it's just got the two. So let's get rid of the dialogue tags and see if it sounds more fluid. "Don't drink any of that," said Mose. "It's getting late. Let's get you back home." I shook my head. "I'd like to stay here for a moment longer. It will be hours before Henry gets back from his studio, and if I'm late, he'd never guess where I'd been." I laughed. "Maybe I should tell him." "I hope that was an attempt at humour," said Mose. "I'm sure you do. But then you do have an interest in Henry's continued goodwill. After all, you're seducing his wife, aren't you?" I saw contempt in his face. "You have an odd notion of propriety," I said. "I dare say you think a man can get away with any crime, any betrayal, as long as appearances are safeguarded. I don't suppose it matters at all to you whether I suffer or not." "You're overwrought," he said. "Not at all. I expect you to know all about pretense. After all, you're an expert." So, see what I did there? I got rid of most of the dialogue tags except the ones that were necessary to remind the reader who is speaking. I could, I guess, have replaced an "I said" by a gesture. You can do that. I find that in my books, my characters are constantly either taking sips of tea or wine or something, and I have to watch that because that's a writing tic that I've introduced to avoid having too many dialogue tags, but sometimes I just have too many cups of tea and wine. But you can see already how much quicker that dialogue sounds and how little I've really lost. I noticed that my Effie is doing a lot of wild laughing. I don't think I need to keep too much of that because much of how she says what she says is already implied in the way she says it. If I did a third pass over this, I would probably take away some of those words because I find that it's a bit of a wordy conversation. If I wanted it to be really snappy, I would probably get rid of some of that. And let's see if I can do that. Don't drink any more of that, said Mose. Let's get you back home. I shook my head. I'd like to stay. It will be hours before Henry gets back. And even if I'm late, he'll never guess where I've been. Maybe I should tell him. I hope that was humour, said Mose. I'm sure you do. But then, you have an interest in Henry's continued goodwill. After all, you're seducing his wife. I saw contempt in his face. I don't suppose it matters to you whether I suffer or not, I said. You're overwrought, he said. Not at all. I expect you to know all about pretense. After all, you're an expert. So I've stripped that down to a minimum, and I don't think it's lost all that much there either, because what I really wanted from that conversation was a confrontation between my heroine, who until now has been cowed and obedient and is just starting to show a little agency, and my not quite hero, who is beginning to show his unheroic qualities. And I think that would work, probably. If I wanted to work on it properly, I would do it in a sort of less impromptu way. But you see what I mean? Dialogue can be made slow with a lot of extraneous explanations and draggy, or it can be made faster and snappier at will. And this is what I was talking about the other day when I was talking about the management of tension. Obviously, if you accentuate the tension, you will speed up the pace. If you bring the tension down, you will slow the pace down. And the whole of your handling of plot and associated things like characterization, like dialogue, is about that handling of tension and making sure that you have enough fast, energetic, tense moments and enough slow moments of come down, and that they come at the right place. This was not the time to have a slow moment of come down because I'm trying to escalate the tension within this scene. And you will have noticed that I read all this aloud, not just for you. I do this anyway. I do this when I'm alone. Dialogue needs to be read aloud. Dialogue is supposed to approximate real, natural speech, but with all the things that you don't want to read on the page taken out, all the humming and hawing and the repetition and the things that don't make sense, all of those things stripped out to have something readable and yet that feels and sounds natural. And reading aloud is the best tool in your box when it comes to editing dialogue. You read dialogue aloud and it will show you where you're slowing yourself down, where an adverb is unnecessary, where a dialogue tag can be stripped out. Now, for your exercise today, for your 15 minutes, I want you to find a page in a book, any book, a page of dialogue. It can be your dialogue, it can be somebody else's dialogue, and I want you to read it aloud. Have a look at the dialogue tags. Have a look if there are adverbs. See if it would benefit from any of those things being stripped out. If there aren't any, congratulations, you found a great piece of dialogue. If there are, congratulations, you spotted something that somebody else didn't spot, and you will be better. When you start to write your dialogue, you will be writing it in a slightly different way, a slightly better way, I hope. Tomorrow we'll be talking about editing, so join me then. Until then, have a good day. See you later.